My name is Daphne Lazar-Price. I'm the Executive Director of JOFA, the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance. Welcome, and thank you all for joining us this evening. Tonight, we're honoring the memory of Justice Ginsburg, a woman who helped pave the way for so many of us in so many ways. While she served as judge, just a few key decisions worth mentioning. How in 1996, she wrote the majority opinion that it's unconstitutional for schools funded by taxpayer dollars to bar women. She paved the way for the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which passed in 1974 and allowed women to apply for credit cards and mortgages without a male cosigner. She helped women make great strides towards equal pay, and she pushed to protect pregnant women in the workplace. And in so many other ways, she continued to be a role model, certainly by showing that there are plenty of opportunities for women in age 60 and up. She was 60 when she was confirmed to the Supreme Court, where she ably served until she passed away just a month ago. She was really an incredible judge. She was fierce and a visionary advocate, and she's, when Rachel and I were texting about this, Rachel pointed out that she's at least partially responsible for how we both have been able to live our lives. And as a mark of Hakarat Tov on a personal level, I actually went down to the Supreme Court to be part of her broader levaya, one of tens of thousands of people who stood before her as she lay in repose. And though I know that in some circles that her decision for how she lay there was met with some criticism, but I found it to be an incredibly holy moment. Tonight we're going to honor Justice Ginsburg's memory by marking the Shloshim, which was actually yesterday, with some text study, eulogy and reflection, and finally a Siyum Mishna. I want to introduce, first I want to thank everybody for joining us, and I want to thank our speakers for this evening. And I want to particularly thank Rabba Wendy, who actually inspired the Siyum. She actually held a separate Siyum last night. Rabba Wendy Amsellem teaches Talmud and Halacha at Yeshivat Maharat and is the editor of Yeshivat Maharat's Karen Journal. She's also a faculty member at Drisha and at Pardes, and she is an editor at the Lehr House. Wendy received smicha from Yeshivat Maharat and is an alumna of the Drisha Scholars Circle and high school program. She has a BA in history and literature from Harvard University. And Rabba Wendy is going to be sharing with us some words of Torah.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm so excited that we're doing this together. When I guess I found out, as most of us did on Rosh Hashanah, that Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg had passed away. And I think one of the things that was very interesting was that so many of us felt kind of a real feeling of mourning when we heard the news. Unlike Rachel, I wasn't lucky enough to know Justice Ginsburg myself, but I felt very connected to her for many years. And one of the reasons why I felt so connected to her was actually when I was 21, I received a letter from her that contained a story that wound up being very meaningful to me. I was a first-year law student then at Harvard Law School, and my friend Lisa Klepper and I were kind of hosting, there was a Women's Law Association dinner, and we decided to make it sort of a retrospective on the early years of women at Harvard Law. And so we wrote letters, because this was back in 1996, before kind of email was a real thing. So we wrote like actual letters to all of the women from the first couple of years of women attending Harvard Law School, and we asked them about their experiences. And almost all of them wrote back to us, which was great, including Justice Ginsburg. And she told us this story, which has then kind of been told in other places and also was part of the movie about her. But she told us a story about how when she was in her first year of law school, the dean at the time, Dean Griswold, had invited all of the women, all like 6 or 7 of them in her class, over for dinner to his home. And at some point in the middle of dinner, he asked each one of them to justify taking the place of a man at Harvard Law School. And Justice Ginsburg wrote to us that she was fearful of sounding too aggressive. She hadn't yet fully discovered her feminism. And so when she was asked what she was going to do with her career to justify taking the place of a man at Harvard Law School, she said that she had come to law school to better understand her husband's job, and that like maybe one day it would lead to a part-time career for her as well. And even then, I just loved that story. And one of the things I think that made the story really matter to me is that it made it clear that when Justice Ginsburg started her legal career, she actually had no idea where it was going to take her. right? She didn't know that what possibilities would sort of open for her. And I think for me, that became a really important story because it meant that it was okay to sort of start doing something if you weren't sure where it was going to take you. And even though in the end, my path wasn't, I didn't wind up staying in law school and becoming a lawyer. I wound up kind of going into the field of teaching Torah. It felt to me like it was okay to start doing that, even though I couldn't immediately imagine where it would take me because she had done that, and and she had sort of demonstrated that you could start doing something and sort of develop it as you went, and that actually for many women that's kind of part of what embarking on their careers involves doing. You kind of have to start and not necessarily know. You don't have the models in front of you yet of what you can be, but Justice Ginsburg, even though she was in a different field, kind of became a model, I think, for many of us of the sense of like, you have to kind of start and then you develop your possibilities as you go and things open up for you. And so I think that for many of us, we know that our lives are kind of immeasurably better because of the cases that Justice Ginsburg argued as a lawyer and the rulings that she issued as a judge and as a justice. But I think that we're also kind of very personally kind of impacted by how she lived her life. She kind of sort of both in her professional life and also kind of just in the way that she talked about her life. I think she serves as a model for many of us and allows kind of us to feel a personal connection to her, even if we didn't have the privilege of actually knowing her. And so on Rosh Hashanah, when I was kind of thinking about her, it felt to me that what we do when people who matter to us pass away is that we learn Mishnah. And so we learn Mishnah in their memory. And so it seemed that this was a very fitting way, both in terms of honoring her commitment to education and to study, and also in terms of kind of honoring her as a person that we care about. And so I'm really delighted to be a part of this learning of Mishnah in her memory and of the Siyum. The particular tractate that I learned as part of the Siyum was Tractate Nigaim. Tractate Nigaim deals with all sorts of different kinds of leprosy, right? Leprosy that can form on a person's body, leprosy that can form on a person's clothing, leprosy that can form on a person's home. Very detailed descriptions of these different kinds of leprosy. But I wanted to share one particular Mishnah from that tractate that kind of resonated with me and that also kind of made me think about Justice Ginsburg's legacy. So I'm going to attempt right now to share my screen with that. Oh no, participant screen sharing has been disabled. Is it possible to enable it, Danny? If not, I will just read it. Oh, okay, great. Let me try. I'll try again. Awesome. Okay. Okay, so this is, as I said, this is the Mishnah from the 12th chapter of Nigaim, the 5th Mishnah in the parak, and we're told, Kitzad Re'iyat Habayit, right? What's the procedure for inspecting a house where we think that there might be leprosy on the walls, right? How do we go about doing it? We're told, Uva asher lo habayit v'higid la kohen lemor. The homeowner comes to the priest, comes to the kohen, and says to the priest, Kinnegan your ali babayit, right? It seems to me that there is something like a plague in my home. The Mishnah now says, that was a citation from Vayikra, from Leviticus, and now the Mishnah comments on this and says, Afilu talmid chacham v'yodea shehu nega vadai, even if the homeowner is a sage and knows for sure that this is really a plague, this is really some sort of leprosy on their house, lo yigzor v'yomar nega nira li babayit, still the person shouldn't announce a plague has appeared on my house to the priest. Rather, the person should come to the priest and say, I think that maybe there is a plague in my home, and the homeowner should leave it to the priest to make the determination. The priest then, even before he comes to make the determination, the priest commands, upinu et habayit, right? He commands that everything be emptied out of the house before he comes to see it. Right? So that way, none of the items that are inside the home will wind up being rendered impure. And then afterwards, the priest comes in, right? The sense is that once the priest declares the home to be impure, then all of the things that are found in the home will become impure. But until the priest makes that determination, nothing is yet impure. So before the priest comes to sort of check it out, the priest advises the homeowner to take everything out of the house so that in case the house is decreed to be impure, those things will be saved. Regarding this, Rabbi Meir says the following thing. Amar Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Meir says, actually, in the end, what's really going to become impure in the house? Im tomar, if you want to say the things in the person's house that could become impure might be their expensive wooden furniture, their clothing, their metal household items. Actually, none of those are such a big deal because all of those things, it's pretty easy to repurify them. If they become rendered impure because the house is impure, you can just immerse the wooden furniture or the clothing or the metal objects. All of those can be immersed in a mikvah and become pure again. So none of that is such a big deal. What is the Torah really worried about? What are the items that the Torah really wants to have taken out of the house because once they become impure, you won't be able to use them anymore? These things are klei charso v'al pacho v'al tafyo, right? The things that the Torah is trying to save are these very inexpensive things. They're things that are made of pottery. They're little oil pitchers, little buckets, right? Things that aren't very valuable at all. But those things, because they're made of ceramic, if they are declared impure, there's no way to purify them again. So those are the things that you most need to take out of the home. And Rabbi Meir says, based on this, if the Torah takes so much care then with a person's kind of humble, inexpensive possessions, all the more so the Torah would be concerned with a person's very precious possessions. If the Torah rather is so concerned about saving a person's property, saving a person's possessions, how much more so would the Torah be concerned about saving human lives, which of course is much more important than property. If the Torah is concerned even with saving the property of a person who is wicked, for the purposes of Tractate Negaim, the Tractate assumes that if a person's body or home is afflicted with leprosy, it's because they've done something wrong. So if even this person who's done something wrong, and that's why there's leprosy on their house, if even the Torah is concerned about that person's possessions, kal v'chomer al shel tzaddik, how much more so will the Torah be concerned about the possessions of those who are righteous? Okay, so the reason why I wanted to share this Mishnah is that, first of all, I think it's very interesting, and also I think this idea that the Torah and that by extension law should be concerned with kind of protecting everyone, not just the powerful, seems to be something that is appearing both in this Mishnah and also very much is the legacy of Justice Ginsburg, right? The sense that it's the law's job to kind of look out for all people, not just for powerful interests. And also that kind of what a person might value might change depending on the person, right? We might think that, oh, a small ceramic thing that is very cheap isn't really so worthwhile. We don't really have to worry about it. We should only worry about things that are very valuable and very expensive. But actually, it might be that the things that a person values the most in their home might actually be something that's made of ceramic, right? That it's not the Torah's job to sort of decide for the person what's valuable and what should be saved, right? The Torah kind of wants to create a situation where Rabbi Meir says that the Torah wants to create a situation where everything can be saved, right? Where a person can sort of have the opportunity to save all the things in their home, regardless of whether there's something that other people would think of as important or not important. And I think this idea of kind of being able to, I'll stop the screen share. I think this idea of being able to sort of decide for ourselves kind of what we value and what we, kind of how we want to live our lives and what roles we want to play in society, instead of having kind of the law decide that for us, is also something that I think is a hallmark of many of Justice Ginsburg's both the cases that she argued and the rulings that she crafted. Right, the sense that people should decide on their own kind of how they want to be in society, what roles they want to fulfill. That each person should kind of make their own choices about their own abilities and their own talents, and it's not the law's job to kind of decide for them that, because of their gender, they should be doing X, or because of their position, they should be doing Y, but that we should create a situation where people can make those determinations for themselves. And so I guess with that, I will stop my learning of Mishnah Negaim, and I'm so excited to hear from Rachel about her experiences with working with Justice Ginsburg.
Thank you so much for that, Rabba Wendy, and excellent choice and use of material, as folks in the chat box have chimed in as well. It is my pleasure and my privilege to introduce Rachel Wainer-Apter, who will share her experiences while clerking for Justice Ginsburg, along with the reflections about the lasting impact of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's legacy. Rachel, hi, great to see you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what inspired you to pursue the profession of law.
So when I was growing up, I knew that I wanted to help people, but I didn't know exactly what that would consist of. And my first job after college was actually working with you, Daphne, at the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. I was one of the legislative assistants. The RAC has this incredible program where people are able to work for a year right after college, acting basically as other organizations have seasoned senior lobbyists. The RAC sends people who graduated college the year before, oftentimes, to these incredible meetings. And so one of the issues that I worked on was economic justice, and I was able to attend meetings regularly with Wade Henderson from the Lawyers Committee and other incredibly visionary and creative advocates for racial and economic justice in Washington, D.C. And I loved the work, and I thought that I wanted to do that forever. And so I asked the people who were a little bit older than me, attending the meetings, what I should do for graduate school. And they all ended up saying that I was trying to decide between law school and public policy school. And they all ended up saying anything that you could do with a public policy degree, you could also do with a law degree, but not vice versa. So you should go to law school just because it will keep the most doors open. So I basically decided to do that. I ended up deferring for a year from Harvard Law School and studying at Drisha for a year first. I was one of the non-reform people who was able to get a job at the RAC the year that I was there. But I learned an incredible amount about the reform movement, and I was really grateful to be there. So I then went to Drisha for a year, then I went to law school at Harvard like Wendy did, and it turned out that I just loved law school, and I really loved the law, and I loved reading judicial opinions and trying to figure out what was motivating the judges, and I loved trying to figure out where the law would move. The law was a series of steps that were moving in a clear direction, it often seemed, and I really liked trying to figure out where it seemed like it would move. And so I was incredibly lucky to then clerk for Judge Rakoff, a district court judge in New York City, and Judge Katzman, who recently finished his tenure as the chief judge of the Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. And then I took some time off, actually. I had a 1-year-old daughter at the time, and we moved to Israel for 6 months, and I volunteered with a legal services organization in Israel once a week while I basically spent a lot of time with my daughter. We lived in Jerusalem. And while I was there, I found out that Justice Ginsburg was interested in interviewing me. Thankfully, one of the judges that I clerked for, called to let me know, because Justice Ginsburg then called at 6 p.m. her time, which was 1 a.m. Israel time. And I spoke to her on the phone, and she asked if I would be interested in coming in to interview in her chambers. And my spouse was standing next to me the whole time, and he said that all I did was say, "Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much." And then eventually I got off the phone. And I happened to have been going back to America for a cousin's wedding in a few weeks. So I asked the justice if I could wait a few weeks to come back from Israel, and I did. And I went, I vividly remember taking the train down to meet the justice, and then being really impacted while I was sitting in her office by She had many different tzedek tirdof pieces of artwork, both behind where she sat, so behind her desk, and then also on her bookshelves where she kept a number of photos and mementos. And I remember being impacted at the time by how important Judaism was as a force in her life. Even if it was not from a religious perspective. I came from a place where Judaism was an important part of my life from a religious perspective. But I remember thinking how important it was for the justice as well, even if not in exactly the same way. One thing that I realized, Daphne, even though you did not mention anything about my professional capacity in the introduction, I'm supposed to give a disclaimer that I'm speaking only in my personal capacity and not in any official or professional capacity. So
Great.
thanks for allowing me to do that.
Thank you. Okay, so now fast forward a little bit, and you start the job. Can you describe what your first days were like on the job clerking for the notorious RBG?
So as Wendy pointed out, there's a lot that's known about the justice, and many people feel very close to her because of the notorious RBG mem that then turned into a book, that then turned into a documentary and a movie and t-shirts and tattoos and Halloween costumes and socks and everything.
And a lace collar.
Right, the jabot.
Yep.
I did a conversation actually last week where the group sent everyone a t-shirt with a jabot on it in advance so that everyone who participated on Zoom was wearing a jabot. So yes, there's a lot that everyone knows about Justice Ginsburg, which I think is pretty incredible because she's one of the best role models you could have. So one of the things that is true about Justice Ginsburg is that she is an incredibly hard worker, and she takes the task of being a justice. She took the task of being a justice incredibly seriously. And it was very easy as a law clerk, thankfully, to also understand the gravity of the position. It is not possible to be in the Supreme Court building without having a sense of awe at the gravity of what you are undertaking. The building, for anyone who has not visited, it is worth a visit. It is constructed out of large slabs of marble over the course of many years in the 1930s. It is truly awe-inspiring. There are friezes in the courtroom of different lawgiver scenes throughout history, including from the Tanakh. And it is really awe-inspiring, as I said. So my first few days on the job were really feeling the awe and the gravity of the position and taking it incredibly seriously. And that was basically the entire year. But it was easy to do that because the justice also took the work incredibly seriously. And like Wendy mentioned, the justice felt that the law was not a theoretical. The law was not a puzzle to crack. The law was not a game. The law was not theoretical. The law was something that impacted the people in every single case in ways that were fundamentally important and that needed to be understood before a decision could be reached. So Justice Ginsburg truly understood the profound human consequences of legal decisions and kept that at the forefront of her mind in judging any time. And that was something that she passed on to her clerks as well.
So in an op-ed written for the New York Times in 2016, Justice Ginsburg shares some advice for living she received throughout her life, and some advice she herself gives, including it pays to be a little deaf in marriage and in work, and to tune out the unkind words, to not worry, and that you can disagree with one another, but still show respect for one another. Can you remember any specific advice that Justice Ginsburg ever gave to you?
Yes, thankfully. After I finished clerking with the justice, I was able to go back to visit many times, and she was incredibly generous with her time, and she would sit with me sometimes for more than an hour and talk about career questions that I had, life questions. We talked about where she was traveling. We talked a lot about my children. I had a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old when I started clerking. And then I had a third child soon after I finished. And we spoke a lot about how to have a career and be a parent at the same time. And I was incredibly lucky to have Justice Ginsburg as a role model in all things, not only in judging, but in her relationship with her husband, Marty, which was, the most equal relationship probably that existed in the 1950s anywhere in the United States. That Justice always said that Marty was the first person who cared that she had a brain. But the Justice and Marty really did have an incredibly equal partnership. The Justice would tell a story of how her son, when he was younger, he would sometimes get in trouble at school, and the school would call her every time and tell her that her son had sent the elevator to the wrong floor, or her son had taken the elevator to the wrong floor, or her son had committed some other minor violation. And at some point she said, "This child has 2 parents. From now on, please alternate phone calls. Today is my husband Marty's turn." And after that, they never called her again because they could not imagine bothering an important New York partner at a law firm. And so they could never bring themselves to call Marty, and they were able to handle her son's misbehaviors on their own without calling any of the parents. But specifically in terms of advice that the Justice provided to me when we spoke about parenting and working. I visited the Justice once when I was contemplating a career move, and I had a lot of things that I wanted to accomplish, and I was a little bit all over the place in exactly what I wanted to do. And I emailed the Justice afterwards to say thank you, and she wrote back, quote, "Distant as it may seem to you now, you will have many work productive years ahead after your children become adults," close quote. And I cried while reading the email because I felt like the Justice was telling me that your career is a marathon and not a sprint. And you don't have to worry so much about trying to do everything that you want to accomplish over the course of your lifetime right now. Instead, take things one step at a time. Make sure that you don't end up in a situation where you feel burned out or where you feel like it is taking too much time away from your children or your ability to be a meaningful part of your children's lives. And try to keep the long game in mind and to recognize that it's a marathon and not a sprint. And I thought that was incredibly important advice, and advice that I've tried to take to heart in every decision that I've made since.
Very wise. I'm sorry, I'm just smirking about the part how she would get the phone calls. I know that so many of us have the same issues, like I do. I know Pam does. I know other people do, that schools call the moms first, and we're like, there are 2 parents here. Anyway, what is something that you learned about working for Justice Ginsburg that you found to be surprising, or something that only those close to her would know or get to experience?
So the Justice was famous for her work hours, and a lot of people might know that the Justice sometimes worked late into the night. When she was in law school at Harvard, her husband was undergoing treatment for cancer, and she took to first attending her own classes, then going home and spending time with her 1-year-old daughter, Jane, then putting Jane to bed and retyping all of the notes of her husband's classmates so that her husband could use his classmates' notes in order to study while he was not going to class, and then starting on her own schoolwork at 2 o'clock in the morning, and evidently would only get like 1 or 2 hours of sleep, and that was okay. I do not share that with the Justice at all. But so the people might have heard about the justice leaving messages for clerks at 2 o'clock in the morning. I was lucky that I did not get a ton of those, but the justice never expected that the law clerks would be in chambers just because she was. So the justice oftentimes would stay, far later than we did after we had gone home. The justice also, as I said, took the job incredibly seriously, and she would edit with a red pencil. So sometimes if you would hand the justice a draft opinion, she would take her red pencil and make a circle around the whole page and make a cross through it, and then turn the page over and then hand write in pencil what she wanted that page to say instead. You would usually hope not to get a editing that was, the entire page crossed out and rewritten on the back, but it was not unheard of. The justice would then sit with us individually in chambers and go through each of her edits to explain why she had made a particular change, why she thought that a particular word was important. And that was really an unbelievable experience in terms of really learning how important language is. The justice not only took every single written word seriously, but she took every word that came out of her mouth seriously. The justice was one of the most thoughtful and deliberative people when it comes to speech that I have ever met. When I was interviewing with the justice, actually, someone told me that the justice had a particular way of speaking, which anyone who has met her might know, where she pauses often while speaking. And it's not because she is finished, it's because she is thinking of the next word. And the words come out of her mouth then perfectly. And she never says oops or and she never goes back and starts over at the beginning of the sentence. She can just continue on perfectly by taking pauses. And so when I was interviewing with the justice, someone had told me this, and they told me that every time the justice stopped talking, I should count to 10 before I said anything, so that I wouldn't accidentally interrupt the justice or speak over her when she meant to continue to speak. And so I did that, and that meant that I actually did not speak almost at all during my entire interview. It turned out that counting to 10 was too much, and when I then counseled clerks going forward, I told them to count to 3. And I think that might have worked better, although the justice offered me the job while I was in the interview, so it turned out that it was okay that I did not speak at all, but I barely said anything while I was there. But so the justice not only valued the written word, as I said, she also was incredibly thoughtful about spoken word. And so there would be times where I would have to go into the justice's chamber and she would be dictating a court order or a note that she would want to send to another chambers. And she could literally pause, think about it, and then dictate the entire thing, sometimes like 2 pages. I always made sure I had a legal pad before I went in, and she would just keep going, and it would be 100% perfect at the end. She could cite cases and get the citation correct while she was verbally dictating the order, and then you would just go back and type it up and it would be exactly perfect as she wanted it. So I think that's another thing that was an up-close view. I guess the only other thing that I'll talk about is eating habits. I'm sure some people have heard the justice really loved cookies. We baked cookies in chambers in a small toaster oven that we kept. And she also had a certain kind of cookie that she really liked from the cafeteria. Some have probably heard that she herself was not much of a chef. Her husband, Marty, was the cook in the family. I clerked for Justice Ginsburg after Marty had died, about a year after he tragically died. And her daughter used to come down to Washington and cook huge amounts of food and individually package them so that the justice would have something to take out and warm up and eat, because she was otherwise not preparing food for herself. Although cookies did end up keeping her going a lot as well.
I'm just curious, when you spoke to her, how did you refer to her? Was it Justice? Was it Ruth? It
was Justice. And that is a particular way that I have always referred to everyone for whom I clerked. So Judge Rakoff, I called Judge. Judge Katzman, I called Judge. Justice Ginsburg, I always refer to as Justice. Her clerks refer to her when she's not there as the Justice, capital J. And I have written several articles about Justice Ginsburg, and the publication always makes the J in Justice lowercase. And it makes me very uncomfortable to read it when they write, or they change what I write to say the Justice with a lowercase j, because I'm so used to always writing the Justice with a capital J, even if I was speaking to a co-clerk or someone else in chambers.
Okay. So a little bit of more interpersonal stuff. The decisions delivered by the Supreme Court are often polarized, and yet we also hear about the warm friendships shared among the justices. What were your observations about the camaraderie of the justices?
So Justice Ginsburg's relationship with Justice Scalia was for real. They spent many years, they would spend New Year's Eve together with their whole families, including some of Justice Scalia's children and both of their spouses. They traveled together. There's a wonderful picture of them on an elephant together that some of you might have seen. And they did legitimately have a close relationship. And the Justice is well known for saying that you can disagree without being disagreeable. Otherwise, the law clerks did not get to spend a ton of time with all of the justices together. The justices very much each kept to their own schedule. There were jokes that Justice Ginsburg would pass Justice Kennedy when she was leaving for the night and he was arriving, because he was a very early riser and would get to the court at 6 a.m. and Justice Ginsburg would be leaving the court at 6 a.m. to go home. But there were some times where we were able to be with all of the justices together. And I think that they all were very serious about the fact that they were working together day in and day out. And it was important that they had a good relationship. And so before they hear arguments on any given day, they all shake each other person's hand. They all go into a room called the robing room to put on their robes and then shake each person's hand before they go onto the bench together. On days where they hear arguments or where they have conference, they also have lunch together in a special dining hall upstairs at the Supreme Court. And they really do take collegiality very seriously.
Thank you. So you were a clerk for Justice Ginsburg at a time when there were several highly anticipated cases in front of the court. Did you feel that pressure as decisions were released? And can you remember how Justice Ginsburg reacted to and handled the intense pressure?
So Justice Ginsburg, as I said, thought that every case was the most important to the litigants in that case. And so I think Justice Ginsburg felt intense pressure to get every case right, and not only to get every case right, but in opinions that she would draft to get every word in every case right. She took every word seriously. We as law clerks actually, before we started and at the beginning so I guess I should have mentioned this in talking about my first few days. We would read her judicial decisions so that we would understand how she constructed sentences, what types of words she liked to use. The clerks had lists that they passed on of words that the justice liked to use to start a sentence, words that the justice liked to use at the end of the sentence. So we really were trying to emulate her writing style because she took the written word, as I said, so seriously. So I don't recall the justice treating any one case, treating the hand down of the case. The hand down is when the court announces the decision in the case, and oftentimes they do so from the bench, and the justice, as you might have read, has a special collar that she took to wearing if she was announcing the majority opinion, and a special collar that she took to wearing a jabot if she was announcing a dissenting opinion. I don't remember the justice treating one hand down as more important than another, even in some of the incredibly closely watched cases that I was privileged to be there for. The justice thought that every case was the most important to the litigants, and the justice also had spent years before she became a law professor at Rutgers and then at Columbia, and then before she became the head of the ACLU Women's Rights Project, she had worked in Sweden and had lived in Sweden for periods of time and wrote the book on Swedish civil procedure at the time. And so she took civil procedure incredibly seriously. And so for the justice, some of the most important cases were cases that perhaps were not the most closely watched, because civil procedure cases are not usually the political 5-4 decisions that you hear about.
So we also know that Justice Ginsburg was an outspoken advocate for gender equality and a feminist icon, and through many of her opinions over the years, she paved the way for so many people to advance and achieve more than what society thought they deserved, but what the law stated they were entitled to. Do you believe she realized the enormity of her decisions?
Yes, I think so. I think that, first of all, to the justice, as Wendy mentioned, it was obvious that all people should have equal opportunity to dream, achieve, and set the course of their own lives without artificial barriers because of gender or race or religion or nationality or sexual orientation or gender identity or disability. And that was really the guiding principle of her life. Equal rights, not only for men and women, but for everyone. And I think that she did realize the impact that she had. The justice was largely responsible in the 1970s, before she became a judge, for convincing 9 male Supreme Court justices that the United States Constitution enshrined equal citizenship for women in the text. And they had not previously thought that it did. And many of them had not previously thought that there was a such thing as gender discrimination. And the justice was incredibly strategic and thoughtful about how to convince these 9 people that gender discrimination existed and that laws that they thought of as protecting women were keeping women not in a pedestal, but in a cage. And I think that she did realize the enormity of that work. And I think that when you mentioned, Daphne, the VMI case, so in 1996, Justice Ginsburg wrote the majority opinion in a case against the Virginia Military Institute, which ran a program to train students to become citizen soldiers, and only men were eligible for admission to become citizen soldiers. They created a separate school for women, but it did not train women how to become citizen soldiers, and the education was otherwise, the justice found, not comparable. And I think for the justice to be able to write in that decision on behalf of the United States Supreme Court that any law that was going to differentiate based on gender needed to have an exceedingly persuasive justification for doing so was really the culmination of her life's work, where it was her painstaking case-by-case approach that made the Supreme Court recognize that any law that distinguished on the basis of gender was even worth looking at, let alone that it required an exceedingly persuasive justification. And I think that she did realize how important that was, not only, as I said, to the life of men and women, but really to the life of everyone who wants to have the ability to set their life's course without stereotypes or prejudice.
Thank you. And last question. When the history books are written, what do you believe will be Justice Ginsburg's lasting legacy?
I think it will be what I just said, actually, just that both as a law professor and as an attorney at the ACLU, Justice Ginsburg was largely responsible for convincing the Supreme Court to enshrine equal citizenship for women into the US Constitution. But her work was not only about equal rights for women, it was about creating a more equitable society for all of us. And I think we are all incredibly grateful for all that has meant since her pioneering work started in the 1970s.
Wow, thank you, Rachel. you've given us, we've all read a lot about the justice. Now I will refer to her as the justice. And you've just added so much layer and nuance to her personality, and given us a glimpse into what it was like to be in proximity of such brilliance and forward thinking. We're going to shift to the last portion of our program this evening, the Siyum Mishna, that's going to be led by Pam Scheininger. Pam, for those of you who don't know, is the president of JOFA. She is also the past president of the Yavne Academy in Paramus, New Jersey, and past president of Netivot Shalom in Teaneck, New Jersey, and also the past chair of the Netivot Shalom Youth Committee. Should I keep going, Pammy? And past president of the Parent Association of Yavne Academy.
Okay.
And she lives in Teaneck with her 4 children. Pammy.
So it is what was Wendy going to say something? It is a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for asking me. I will add to all the stories, and I only have one, that I also felt very personally connected to the justice, even though I never met her, because even though she spent 2 years at Harvard, she graduated from Columbia, and that was my law school. So she would, and her daughter Jane, in fact, taught at Columbia Law School when I was there. So I always felt with all of the stories that she was my role model in that respect as well. I had the privilege of learning Demai, Masachet Demai, for the Siyum Mishna, and I'm going to now recite Hadron because we are virtual. We're not going to be saying Kaddish at the end. It's also a really hard Kaddish, but I would have been happy to do it. And hopefully in the future, when we are in person once again, we can have a Siyum in which we complete it all. So Hadran alach Shisha Sidrei Mishna veHadrach Alan. Ta'atan alach Shisha Sidrei Mishna u'Ta'atach Alan. La nit Nashe Minach Shisha Sidrei Mishna v'la tit Nashe Minan. La be'alma haden v'la be'alma da'ate. Hadran alach Shisha Sidrei Mishna veHadrach Alan. Ta'atan alach Shisha Sidrei Mishna v'Ta'atach Alan. La nit Nashe Minach Shisha Sidrei Mishna v'la tit Nashe Minan. La be'alma haden v'la be'alma da'ate. Hadran alach Shisha Sidrei Mishna veHadrach Alan. Ta'atan alach Shisha Sidrei Mishna v'Ta'atach Alan. La nit Nashe Minach Shisha Sidrei Mishna v'la tit Nashe Minan. La be'alma haden v'la be'alma da'ate. Yehir Ritzel Nefanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'lehei B'teinu Shetehei Toratcha Umunatenu ba'olam hazeh Uzehei Imanu la'olam haba. Chanina bar Papa, Rami bar Papa, Nachman bar Papa, Achai bar Papa, Abba Mari bar Papa, Rafram bar Papa, Rafish bar Papa, Sorcha bar Papa, Ada bar Papa, Zaru bar Papa. Harevna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Torah b'finu b'vet amcha beit Yisrael v'niyeh anachnu b'tzeinu amcha beit Yisrael kulanu yodei shemecha b'lemdei Torah lishma. Mo'evei techakmeni mitzvotecha kli l'olam hili. Yehili bi tami b'chukecha, laman lo evoshlo, lam lo eshkach pikudecha, ki vam chaitanu, baruch atadonai lamdenu chukecha, amen, 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 sela ve'ed. Modzim anachnu lefanecha, Adonai Eloheinu b'lehei b'teinu, shesamtach l'keinu miyoshvei beit hamidrash, v'lo samtach l'keinu miyoshvei kranot, she'anu mashkimim v'hem mashkimim, anu mashkimim l'divrei Torah, v'hem mashkimim l'dvarim b'tilim, anu amilim v'hem amilim mekablim schar, v'hem amilim v'einam mekablim schar, anu ratzim v'hem ratzim l'chayei ha'olam haba, Dehem ratzim leve'er shachad, shenam arbat ha'elohim taridem leve'er shachad, anshe damim u'mirma lo yechetzu yemehem, va'ani eftach bach. Yiratzam levanecha Adonai Elohei, kashem she'ezer tani l'sayem shisha sidrei Mishna, kenta azreinu lahachil masakted usfarim akrim u'l'sayman, l'modu l'lamed l'shmor b'lasot l'kayem akol divrei Talmud Toratecha b'ahava, zechut kol atanaim v'amoraim v'talmidei chachamim ya'amod li u'lizari shelo Talmud shetorah mipi zara zeri ad olam, v'tikayem bi b'hidalecha tancha otach, v'shachbecha tishmor alecha v'hakitzotza hid sheshichacha ki bi yirbu yemecha b'yosifi l'chashnot chayim orach yamim b'yimina b'smola osher b'chavod Adonai oz la'amo yiten Adonai yivarech et amo b'shalom. You're muted.
I know, I realized you did. What a powerful and important way to mark the memory of a remarkable woman. I want to once again thank all of you for joining us. Rabba Wendy, Rachel, Pam, thank you. Danny for being our Wizard of Oz behind the scenes, and for everybody who joined us here this evening. Yasher Koach to each of you, and onward. Have a good night.